In a fog-shrouded harbor, a quiet boy named Jonah trades people's sorrows by capturing and softening their shadows. His gift brings relief, but also danger. Each mercy risks erasing what keeps them human. As a pale stranger arrives, seeking to turn grief itself into currency.
I suppose one could say I took the city apart and learned to put it back together by ear. We had, after the blast, a geography of absence, streets that felt like hollow shells, rooms with their faces blown out, curtains of stars where facades had been. The pianos were the hardest things to account for. They did not look like ruin at first glance. They looked like the timetables of private life, upholstered and lacquered, full of chairs that had been sat in, of knees that had tapped rhythm. When the bombing ended and the living began again in the interstices, I came to understand that the instruments would not simply be remembered by their owners. They would carry what had happened inside them. A broken action might contain the last phrase a mother sang to a child. A water-stained bass could whisper the damp breath of a corridor shared by lovers. I learned to read these things with my fingers. My work is scavenging and coaxing. I go where the city has been opened like a casket, beneath ceilings that have collapsed, and into basements that smell of dust and coal and the faint soreness of old flour. I have come to prefer the hour when the light is thin and the ruin looks less like a wound and more like a subject for careful surgery. I bring a satchel of tools, not because I expect to do everything, but because I like to keep the instruments of repair close to my body. The satchel is a kind of prayer: chisels, small planes, a jeweler's saw, lining glue in a chip jar, a selection of reclaimed ivory shims, a spool of brass wire for pins, sandpaper the color of old bread. There is a small, secret compartment in my bench where I keep fragments I am not ready to catalog: a ribbon, a ticket stub, a scrap of a program. These are the things I do not show anyone. The first time I saw a piano after the siege, it was not even in a living room. It lay half in the street, its lid open as if gasping. A piece of plaster had scored its side like a fingernail. In the absence of a conservatory, anyone who had the energy and the courage to move such an object learned some new vocabulary. We learned how to lift an instrument so it did not pull apart at the ribs. We learned how to thread a strap under a harp without cracking its soundboard further. We learned how to read the shop marks stamped into brass pins like a hidden litany. I learned, too, how to listen. You can hear a piano before you touch it. There is a particular silence inside a collapsed instrument, a scent and a stillness like the pause that follows a sentence that has been interrupted. That day we hauled an upright from a collapsed salon. It had belonged, a neighbor said, to a woman whose windows looked over a small garden now full of weeds and shards. We packed it on our shoulders like a coffin. The lacquer had blistered where the heat had licked it. The legs were splintered. I remember the way light fell on the puddles in the salon's floor, and how the gilt mirror over the mantel had become a bruise of black glass. We carried the instrument past a line of houses that had lost their front walls, where staircases were freestanding and families had built small tented rooms in the shadows. Someone, old man Petrov, I think, hummed as we passed, a fragment of a conductor's memory that steadied me. He did not ask what I would do with it. It is my habit to clean slowly. There is a kind of prayer in removing the dust from keys, in finding the grit between the ivory and the wood, in replacing a broken pad with patience rather than force. The method looks like the practice of any careful hand, nothing brusque, nothing rushed. I oil pins in small, circular motions. I glue fractures with linen resin that sets like skin. My fingers have learned the shapes of tiny compromises. To restore a key is to respect the history of an object, and to acknowledge the compromises the object will endure. One does not pretend to recover what was lost. One acknowledges that the instrument will bear its scars and one's own. The upright from the salon took me a week. I had to rebuild its action almost entirely. Someone, in a hurry, had jammed a splintered leg back on with a nail. Someone else had used the bench as a table and carved initials into the apron. The inner frame smelled faintly of perfume. There was a small paper wad in the soundboard cavity I did not expect, a folded ticket, paper browned by heat and time, and a slip of ribbon blue, with one edge frayed. I do not know why I keep telling this as if I could withhold the things that make a memory particular. Perhaps because the smallness of the objects is what keeps them alive. Great gestures die, scraps persist. I always test a repaired key in the afternoon, when the light has a certain flatness and the room is quiet. You need a quiet room to hear the ghosts that linger in wood. I set the key, press, and I listen. The first few times it is like waking a sleeping child. The sound can be brittle or apologetic, or at times it will be an unremarkable note that might have resided there for a lifetime. The sound I found in that upright was none of those things. When I pressed the key after seating the fractured wood and letting the adhesive close like a seam, the note that emerged was not a tone I could have anticipated. It arrived as hesitation, as a stutter shaped like a pulse. It had no sustain, only a short, almost breath-like attack and a tiny residual shadow that faded like the trace of a palm on glass. My first reflex was to check the preparation. Had I overclamped? Had a spring been misaligned? But the mechanism was sound. The note sat there, plain as a finger bone, and in that place between the attack and the decay I recognized a pattern I had thought belonged only to some part of my private life. Elise's heartbeat is not, strictly speaking, unique. Many heartbeats share cadences, quick beginnings, slow endings. But memory is more than an anatomical record. Memory is a theft and a charity. I remember the night the sirens came like a clarinet slide. The way she reached across a table and found my hand. How the apartment smelled of boiled cabbage and soap. I remember her laughter in a doorway, the precise tilt of her head when she corrected the rhythm of a song we had both half remembered from conservatory classes. Her heartbeat, in my recollection, had a small, hesitant first beat, then a broad, confident second, then a trailing, shy third, as if the heart itself were humoring conversation. When that repaired key gave me a beat that matched, I felt a vertigo that had nothing to do with my technical work. I do not mean to imply some supernatural continuity. The work of repair and the work of memory are entangled, yes, but I do not subscribe to superstition as others do. I cannot claim the piano chose to remember Alice. I can say only that the note opened a seam in me and the instrument, and through it memory found a way to be heard. For a long time that sufficed. The logic was small and personal. There was a private ecstasy in the idea that I could, with glue and splints, coax back a voice that mattered to me. It felt like not only penance but possibility. I had believed, after the siege, that sound could be a remedy. It was simpler, in the first days, to feel the work as a redemptive loop. I restored instruments so they could make music. The music then retrieved what had been muffled in me. There are tricks to hearing things you want to hear. You can prime your own memory until it corrals any neutral sound into the shape of expectation. I am aware of this. My ears have been worked like a violin. Still, the recognition that day was not a trick. It came with a physical rush, the hairs on my forearm lifted. I tasted metal and dust. I felt an odd flutter behind the breastbone. The note asked a question, why there and not elsewhere, on a restored key in another piano? I could not answer. Perhaps wood remembers the rhythm of a hand that weighed on it for years. Perhaps the person who owned the salon had sat at that precise key while Elise sang one afternoon, and the impression had been transferred like an old scar. The correct answer, if there is one, is small and technical and also not the point. The point was that I could no longer keep my work within the walls of neat technique. The work had become testimony. I told myself I would not tell anyone. That is a ridiculous sentence to write, and yet it is true. The thing that makes grief durable is not speech but custodianship, keeping an object's meaning narrow enough so it does not evaporate under scrutiny. So I kept the ribbon, folded and pressed between a scrap of linen, and I put it in the hidden drawer of my bench. I methodically continued the work. I rebacked the pin-block, replaced a dozen felts with new ones scraped to the precise density I wanted, tuned the strings until the instrument held its breath properly. Each action was a discipline, an attempt to translate reverie into craft. I do my work like a surgeon stitches skin, small, steady motions that presume a body will be living when the thread is done. At dusk I walked back through streets that still smelled of smoke. The city in the evening has the look of a string instrument played upside down, facades like soundboards, windows like F-holes, alleys that guide the echo. Many houses have become silent. Sometimes a child will come out of a doorway and clap their hands at a passing cart. Sometimes a woman will set a basin on the stoop and scrub at clothes until the water looks like turning light. Old man Petrov was there on the corner, humming as he had been when we carried the piano. He nodded to me, an almost imperceptible confirmation that the city had found one more salvageable voice. I felt less like an artifact rescuer and more like a thief with a conscience. There are other kinds of salvage. The city has plenty of people who would rather build a story than attend to the actual materials. They will arrive with lists and forms and bureaucratic hands that know how to convert ruin into narrative. I had run up against such men in the weeks after, officials who wanted catalogues of resilience to show foreign delegations. Men who could see a bent leg as an opportunity for a photograph. For now the upright sat in my workshop like something I owed a prayer to. I did not know then that the sound I had resurrected would make custody more complicated. I only knew the small, private law I had set for myself: repair these things, listen as if they might speak, and keep safe what they hand back to you. At night I could still hear the thin echo of that first heartbeat note. It hung in my head like a motif. I pressed my palm to the wood of my bench and felt the echo of the day's work. Somewhere in the house a neighbor was playing deliberately, or out of habit, and a phrase drifted up the stairwell, the sort of commonplace melody that settles easily into memory. I thought of Alyssa's mouth finding a wrong note and correcting it gently. I thought of the way she favored a small, private repertoire, songs half remembered, airs taken from the radio, her own humming like a thread behind everything. I am not a man of grand enunciations. I will not claim, in this first recounting, that the world shifted in some miraculous way the day the key stuttered. What shifted was smaller, subtler, the boundary between the object and myself thinned. I had found a new measure by which to judge my days. Where before I had kept the memory populous and raw, now I began to arrange my life around the practice of repair, as if mending could act as a compass. The ribbon in my drawer seemed to confirm what my ears had told me. I slept badly that night, which is another kind of proof. I woke thinking of the ways one sound can make a life available again, but also threaten to enclose it. The following morning I sat at my bench and considered what to do with the upright. There are pianos one returns to families. There are pianos one places in halls, so that children may learn and an institution may boast recovery. There are also pianos one keeps because they have become, in some private fashion, shrines. I had not yet decided which this instrument would be. A man who repairs things for a living must also repair his moral compass from time to time. The city had many claimants. It had also, in the way cities do, an appetite for tidy stories. I set my tools out like a surgeon setting a tray: the little bellows, the glue, the ivory shims sorted by age, the felt pads. The satchel was at my side, the hidden drawer closed. Outside, a child laughed. Inside, the upright waited, black and patient. I pressed the repaired key again and listened. The note arrived, the same hesitant pulse of the day before. I understood, with a clarity that made me start as if burned, that to hear it was to be asked to choose. To remain the sole custodian of a memory that felt, at least to me, sacramental, or to do something else with it, something that might make it communal and thus, in its way, less exacting and, perhaps, less true. I did not know then which path I would take. I only knew that I would keep working. Repair, I have come to believe, is not merely a technical vocation. It is an ethics of attention. To mend is to decide what to keep and what to allow space for. As I closed the heavy workshop door and carried the upright a few yards to where the sun would warm it in the morning, I felt the city press its questions against my back. The first key had spoken. That was the only fact I could trust. What it meant for the living was a question I would learn to answer in the days to come. I held the ribbon in my palm once more, folded the blue into a small square, and tucked it into the hidden drawer. The city had hollow keys and hidden songs, and I had, by a practice of small, patient violence, managed to hear one more life in the instruments that remained. The work was only beginning. Outside, Old Man Petrov's hum threaded through the alleys like a leftover bar from a long-ago rehearsal, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, the particular ache of being both mender and mourner. I would spend the rest of that week with the upright's action between my hands, and I would press that key again and again. Each time the same small pulse would return, patient and unashamed. Each time I would place my ear above the soundboard and try to find in the grain of wood a reason for such fidelity. I learned nothing conclusive. I learned only to attend. It seemed, in that first chapter of work, the only honest thing to do. When night fell and the city folded into itself, I lay awake thinking of the sound, its cadence in my memory, and the small, private shame in wanting nothing more than to keep it to myself. The bench at which I had been working has a small knuckle of wood worn down by years of hands. I rubbed it with my thumb and listened to the thin difference between the instrument's voice and the way I had been taught to hear. Whatever else would come from that repaired key, the interest of officials, the curiosity of neighbors, the unwanted attentions of those who turn grief into spectacle, I had, for the moment, a litany I could live by: glue, patience, and a vow to preserve without turning absence into museum. The city had hollow keys. I had found one that remembered rain. I did not yet know that the remembering would become contagious. I keep my glues in small glass jars, each with a hand-lettered scrap of paper tied around its neck. The scraps look like confessions: rabbit skin, hide fish bladder, a modern synthetic that arrived in a wooden crate once the borders opened. I have learned the names as one learns the names of people one has harmed, and hopes to make amends to each syllable a small prayer for adhesion. When morning finds me at the bench, the jars catch light like a row of old teeth, and the air smells first of coffee and then, once I heat the kettle for the rabbit skin, of the animal warmth that is somehow honest. The workshop becomes, for a few hours, a room in which the world is explained by fixings. A clamp speaks of pressure, a splint of support, a neat dot of hide glue a promise that two broken things can be made to belong again. There is a liturgy to what I do. I lay out my tools in the same order, always a rag, because my hands will smear varnish in their sleep. A tuning hammer with a handle worn smooth in the center where my palm forgets itself and begins to remember Alice. Several sizes of brad awl and an assortment of pins. Strips of seasoned wood for splints. A tray of reclaimed ivory keys, some browned by use, others nicked by desperation. I always move slowly at first, as if to convince the instrument that I intend no harm. The first thing I do is lean close and listen. Listening more than glue has become my method. People who have not lost, or who have lost but never learned the grammar of return, imagine that I repair to restore sound alone. They think of the upright and the proper thing, a polished case, a tuned action, a public performance where applause puts a whole city right. But that is not what draws me to the dust-choked cellars, and to the courtyard where a half-sunken grand rests like a whale. I go because ruined wood holds memory the way a body holds a scar. Not all of it is visible, and much of it requires intimate attention. It is the listening that matters, the way I apply a sliver of glue to a fractured key and then wait for something to answer me. I will not pretend I am scientific about it. There is reason in how I do what I do, a long apprenticeship in how hide glue swells and shrinks with humidity, how too much animal glue leaves a key sluggish, how reclaimed ivory, when sanded just so, keeps its tooth under the fingertip, but there is also a superstition I have not yet named. When I mend a key and then seat the hammer back on its pin, I hold my breath. The first strike is always a gamble. Sometimes I will hear only a clipped, mundane Tchaikovsky passage, or the sound of a wet street outside my window. Sometimes, in whatever key I have coaxed back to life, there will be something else, a cadence that has the exact rhythm of Elisa's pulse. You must understand that I do not mean metaphor. I mean a stuttering rhythm, slightly irregular, like the heart skipping a beat at an unexpected laugh. Or a soft exhale held on the downbeat of a bar. The first time it happened, the note felt like a small animal waking beneath my fingers. I remember the day clearly, rain on the roof of the salon where we had dragged a broken upright from beneath a collapsed cornice. A ribbon of plaster hanging like a forgotten frame. I had pressed splints to the underside of a cracked key and held it together with the smallest clamp that survived the war. When I struck it, the sound rose thinly and then steadied. It was the exact tempo of Elise tapping her foot when she disliked a phrase, rushed, then controlled. I sat back and cried, not because the note was beautiful, but because it answered me. For a long time I managed that first answer as if it were a private mercy, a proof that the world could be coaxed to recall what I had lost. The secret was small and tidy. I would repair and the instrument would return a fragment of her sigh at the end of a rehearsal. The quick laugh in a high register when she was pleased. The way she sometimes hummed the second bar of a Neapolitan song while sewing a button back into a coat. I lined these things up in my head as if making a catalog. High keys gave a laugh. Low keys a breath. In the workshop I began to hum my way through a chronology of pitches the way a grieving man reads a ledger. Then Luca arrived. He found me by the sound of a tuning hammer at dusk, when my light bent and the street outside smelled of coal and the last of the bread. He was more practical than reverent, a machinist's eye on his face, quick to measure and quicker to take apart what he admired. He asked if he could stay. Perhaps he thought he could learn to be useful. Perhaps he hoped to be given work and a roof. He had lost his siblings in an explosion, and the city had less need for idealism than for hands that could make things hold together. I let him because it seemed, in the first months, a small kindness, and because to have another pair of hands under the lid of a grand would make some repairs quicker. Teaching Luca altered my solitude into a performance. I told him names at first, the names of adhesives and why rabbit skin glue, cooked slowly and cooled in a bath, offered a temper that modern resins could not. I showed him how to seat a pin so the hammer did not catch, and how to pair a key bushing until it sang in the correct alignment. He wanted to photograph everything. He kept asking for diagrams. He was impatient with my listening, and I with his appetite for the visible and for acknowledgement. "Why do you warm the glue in your palm?" he asked once, watching my hands with a machinist's curiosity. "Because heat makes it humble," I said. "Because it will take the shape you give it only if you teach it gently." He laughed at that and then watched me work, unashamed of being watched. There were evenings when I would demonstrate a repair and then, by accident or design, the key would answer in a way that made my fingers go cold. I remember one such night Luca had been sanding a strip of ivory while I glued the fractured cap of an old key, and I struck the repaired key to test it. The sound came out thin at first and then rounded, like a hand slipping into mine. For me it had the cadence of Elise saying, in the half-dark after a performance, "You always forget to eat properly." For Luca it was a note, and then he asked if it was the piano's fault or mine that I had cried. This is the burden of work with an apprentice. The manner in which one learns turns truth into a set of techniques. Luca wanted certainty charts, photographs, names he could file away. I wanted reticence, the small shrines of private mending that keep memory from turning to spectacle. I found my patience shortening and my sentences becoming taut, like strings I feared might snap. Neighbors passed what they could not throw away. Enya brought in shredded scores wrapped in brown paper. The pages had been chewed by damp and by mice, but in stitches she had begun to bind them into a curtain, a thing both modest and audacious. "Music becomes shelter," she said, and in her hands the torn signatures felt less like evidence of loss than tools for survival. She pressed a scrap into my palm, a single page, with a line of Ellis's neat hand at the top. The notation was a flourish, something she had marked for a student, legato in the second phrase. I kept the scrap hidden between the boards of my bench the way a small child keeps a secret candy. Isaac came next, bringing with him a jar of a varnish he had saved in wartime, wrapped in oilcloth. He had a manner of speaking that suggested he suspected too, and he did not ask for many things. His repartee was an exchange of craft and loss. He had, once, made a cello that someone paid him with a loaf of bread and a night of shelter. Now he stood in my doorway and watched me lift a key to the light. "You listen differently than I expected," he said. "Most men patch and move on." "I have to," I told him. "There is a point at which repair is not about function. It becomes a way to speak to what is gone." He listened to me strike a single repaired note, and then folded his hands as if to mute a sneeze. "It is dangerous," he said. "To make a private grief into a reproducible effect, danger. The city had taught us all to be precise about danger." I knew he was right. Each time I coaxed the particular timbre, I wanted those small, irregular beats that for me mapped a face and a name I risked making others into voyeurs. Marta Geller, who would come later with a notebook and a persistence that felt clinical, would call it a broadcast. But even before words found shape, there was an ethical arithmetic in what I did. If a sound can be summoned by skill alone, then anyone with the right recipe could replay Elise until she became a commodity. If that happened, I would have preserved not the woman I loved, but an echo polished for display. So I kept lists. I used pencil, not ink, because pencil could be erased, and because the act of erasure felt like a mercy. I catalogued what a given glue did to a given key, the angles, the humidity, the kind of ivory I used. I noted which keys, when repaired, returned a laugh, which returned a reproving murmur. I drew small score-like diagrams, notations in the margin that linked pitch to memory. Luca, for all his impatience, helped here. He liked patterns and could transcribe my shaky notation into cleaner lines. When he did so, however, his hands trembled with the excitement of discovery, and he began to talk of articles and of patronage in the capital. "You will publish this as a study," he said one night, his breath a little too loud in the workshop. "You think they will pay you for it? Or Greta will want the conservatory to reconstruct the whole thing?" Greta's name was currency. The director of the conservatory had already repaired what she could with municipal funds, and had turned a blind eye to certain improvised restorations when they served a return to order. "Maybe," I said, "but I do not want Elise to become a footnote in a speech." Luca looked at me then as if he could see which part of my sorrow was legitimate and which part was vanity. "Then don't publish it," he said. "Keep it private." The irony is that the very act of keeping a thing private has the force of ownership. I had, in my solitude, converted mourning into possession. I would not have admitted it then. I still do not like to say it aloud. I was not merely preserving. I was curating a particular version of her. There were moments I made choices not because a piece needed functional repair, but because a particular angle of splint would make a note more faithful to the way she had paused before a phrase. I am ashamed to write it, and yet truth is not a neat instrument. Sometimes it is a clumsy, guilty thing. One afternoon Enya laid a scrap on my bench and told me a story. She had been mending a coat for an old woman, when suddenly the woman stopped and hummed. "Do you know that song?" Enya asked. She said it sounded like the theater orchestra, the one that used to rehearse on Thursday afternoons. The old woman had not named the orchestra or the city, but names are convertible. Anya had seen Elise there, she said, with a scarf at her throat, teaching a child a lullaby. The seam of Enya's hand brushed mine, and in that small contact I felt both the temptation to show and the compulsion to hide. I slid the scrap into my pocket. That evening I sat at the bench and worked on a key that had been split into two like a dried bone. The rabbit skin glue warmed in my cup, and I applied a thin fillet with a knife, the way one might lay a bandage. I used a splint of pure wood, shaved to fit the curvature beneath the cap, and clamped it with a piece of leather until the glue set. Luca hummed as he sanded. His tune was modern and graceless. When I replaced the key top, I felt the familiar trembling of a man who knows he is about to be forgiven. The note came back with a softness I could place in an instant, Alyssa's small correction when a student held tempo too rigidly. It was not a melody. It was an index, a motion of the mouth. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, and in the sound was a sudden sense of something